Okay, it is 9:45. Greetings to the people that are visiting with us on Zoom. I'm Susan Hassel. We welcome, you can't hear me? Am I not close enough to the mic? Hello, is it on?
No, it wasn't.
Now it's on. Usually my voice carries a lot. It's still not on? I can hear it. Can you hear me now? Okay, maybe I'll just be really close. Okay, today we welcome the Reverend Jim Hudnut-Beumler to the Covenant class. In addition to his critical role of spouse to Dr. Heidi Hudnut-Beumler, Jim is the Ann Potter Wilson Distinguished Professor of American Religious History at Vanderbilt University and Dean of the Divinity School. Prior to coming to Vanderbilt in 2000, he was Dean of the Faculty at Columbia Theological Seminary, a program associate at the Lilly Endowment, and director of the undergraduate program in public and international affairs at Princeton University. He has recently published a new book called The Story of Religion in America, an Introduction. And today we'll share from a book in progress with a presentation on the moral crisis in American Christianity. Am I my brother's keeper? On May 8th, he'll be back. We don't have class in here next week. There's a youth event. On May 8th, Jim will present a second part, Meeting the Moral Crisis in American Christianity, Who is My Neighbor? So with that, thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you, Susan. And it is good to be with you all, both here in person and whoever might be streaming online. This book came together during sabbatical in response to a question that I often get asked after a presentation about something else. I could be talking about the Southern Christianities book or about money in religion, and somebody will come up and just ask some version of the question, either how or when did Christians get to be so mean? Right? This is, there is a sense that people are using their Christianity to enact a kind of meanness. And the fact that I got asked this question so often made me wonder, well, there might be something to that. So here's, and the lens I look at this is through is responsibility. Who am I obligated to? Who am I responsible to and for? How wide does my social horizon go? Is it just my family, other Christians, the whole world? I think you probably know the answer because you go to this church, that it's incredibly capacious. But there's a tendency, and why I'm spending some time before I go into the formal remarks of saying this is there is a tendency in recent years to make our concerns for each other smaller and smaller, our circle of concern. And you should know, well, first of all, where does "Am I my brother's keeper" come from? Anybody? Cain and Abel, Abel and Cain. Exactly. Cain, we'll see that in a little while. And how about who is my neighbor? Where's that come from? Yeah, rich young lawyer asking Jesus, who has said, the sum of the law and the prophets is this, love God and love neighbor, and who is my neighbor, right? So these are two bracketing questions in response to God or God's Son, if you will, that define both what the Hebrew people's faith was about and what Christian faith is about love of God and love of neighbor. You have, 10 commandments, 613 laws, but it boils down to the same thing. Why is it then that we have a moral crisis in America? So let's get into it in earnest. As I said, the motivating question is, when did Christians get so mean? How did they get so mean? And I'm going to read a little bit from the book at times and present a little, so bear with me. There is, I believe, a crisis of credibility, of hypocrisy, of coherence in American Christianity. It is a moral crisis, and if you've read even one David Brooks column in the last 2 or 3 years, you know what I'm talking about. David Brooks is constantly talking about this. Brooks wants evangelicals in particular, and let's be honest about this, evangelicals during your all's lifetime and mine too, have done a flip-flop in terms of their numbers relative to the mainline or ecumenical people. There used to be twice as many or more of us than the mainline ecumenical types than non-denominational freestanding evangelicals and Southern Baptists. Now it's reversed. Both are smaller than they used to be, but there are twice as many people who call themselves evangelical as who identify themselves as belonging to the Presbyterian Church, Disciples of Christ, United Methodists, Episcopalian, so on. So Brooks wants evangelicals in particular to be true to their calling, less political and more generous with other people and with each other. And I do not disagree that something's seriously wrong. And this is also perhaps why so many younger Americans do not want to have anything to do with organized religion. If we take a look at this chart up here, we notice that each successive generation has become less evangelical, less mainline Protestant, not so much less historically Black Protestant, that's held up pretty well, less Catholic, and other Christian groups have kind of held their own, sort of like Mormons, for example. But the biggest thing that's happened generation by generation is the propensity to belong to a church at all, or a faith group. This is true in spite of the fact that on college campuses, being involved in a religious group is a pretty big thing. A lot of people belong to RUF or Navigators or Westminster or Wesley Fellowship or whatever it might be, UKirk in our case. But they don't carry it on into off the campus into a church in anywhere the kinds of numbers that baby boomers like me did, or silent generation people like my parents did. Why is that? Well, sometimes they do not want to be religious because they're concerned about being moral people, good people, ethical actors in a warming world. Young people are much more concerned about global warming than people of our age. They've got more skin in the game, right? They're concerned about living in a world where pervasive hatred for others is based on party and is based on religion, race, gender identity, and positions on guns and abortions that they don't share. Increasingly large numbers of young adults who were raised in a church that they loved, okay, have become progressively disenchanted with the message they hear from the pulpit because they have struggled alongside friends, and this is one of the biggest ones, who are gay or lesbian, bisexual, especially trans, and have noticed that love your neighbor does not include everybody in their church's gaze. There's a generational dissonance that is causing some of this. They may also not be as attracted to us as we are attracted to one another, but I'll leave that aside for a moment. So, the other thing that happens and has been happening for some time is that the whole college experience, and we might also talk about people who don't go to college. So half of all young people go to college, half don't. But what happens in that college experience is often you learn things that you're introduced to topics, concerns about sexism, structural racism, poverty's relationship to capitalism, heteronormativity, words you never heard before, climate change. And they discover that each of these topics, when they try to bring it back home, and if the most strong, if they come from a conservative Christian background and try to talk that stuff at Thanksgiving, that it's about as popular at the family festival table as critical race theory talk is at a Tennessee Board of Education meeting. Yeah, it's so there is this sense of is my parents' faith, is the church I grew up in big enough to handle all the problems of the world? That, in essence, is part of the moral problem. Is the faith big enough to engage all the people and all the problems that we face? Can we take care of our brothers and sisters? And can we love our neighbors as ourselves? So there's a little bit of evidence that just came out in a survey during the pandemic that some younger people, now this was done in 2014, done in 2021 was another survey in which younger people were more likely than in this survey to identify themselves as belonging to the old ecumenical or colonial powerhouse brands like Presbyterian, Episcopal, Unitarian, and what have you. But it remains to be seen if that's real, like bottoms in pew seats, or if it's that's the kind of church I would go to if I went to church. You see? So, in short, David Brooks, back to David Brooks, after experiencing something of a conversion in recent years after the loss of a marriage and creeping dissatisfaction with himself after hanging out with the Trinity Forum people, and you can look them up, and noticing that some Christians really walk the walk of loving God and loving neighbor, has now noticed the same thing that a lot of today's young people, young adults have noticed. Some of these Christians are really mean. Brooks' analysis is that evangelicals have lost their way by substituting white aggrievement, Trumpism, and sexuality fears for the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, morality that once characterized Christianity in this country. I think he's onto something, but my rejoinder as a historian is to do what historians do when confronted with a major development or a crisis. We ask a couple of questions, and I invite you to go along on that journey with me. How long has this been going on? Is this new? And is the situation as it has been described by even a really good journalist and pundit like Brooks, or are there other things going on? And you'll find by the end of this morning that I think some other deeper things have been going on that constitute how we get into the bind of being so narrow and so ideological. I also want to maintain here that this is not just an evangelical crisis, it's a crisis across the panoply of Christian groups. I want to talk about the four largest groups here, but if anybody asks me about Mormons or about Anabaptists, we can talk about them too. But if the evangelicals are the biggest, the mainline is not the next biggest, it's about the same size as Roman Catholics, and the Black church. And each of these churches has its reason for being a different church. Let's see what we can do to mute that. Yeah, it wasn't it? Okay, so my lens, as I said at the very beginning, for looking at how we got to where we are is responsibility. That is, what do the various believers claim as their responsibility or duty or obligation to others? I became interested in this topic when I was working on a book about religion in the contemporary American South, and I encountered people using terms like justice and charity and meaning exactly the opposite things, right? We care deeply about those terms. This is the Christ-haunted region of America. Donovan and I share Iowa, Northwest Iowa in common. And even as Christian as that is, it's not like we encounter here. So what do I make of that? Well, Paul Harvey would say page 4. I encountered in my research somebody named Rex Baker, who illustrates what I'm talking about. Rex Baker is the executive director of Jackson, Mississippi's Gateway Rescue Mission, and he talks about Christian charity in terms of proper charity. It's his qualification of charity. So I invite you into his head about this. Actually, let me depart from the text and talk about why this responsibility thing is so important, and we're not just talking two stories, one from the Old Testament, one from the New. Walter Brueggemann, who sometime in the 1980s wrote the standard reference work on Genesis. It's held up over 40 years, argues that the first 11 chapters of Genesis are among the most important in Scripture. They're among the best known. We all knew Cain and Abel, right? We know Adam and Eve. We know on the seventh day, God rested. We know those stories. We know Noah and the flood and so forth. And they're frequently the most misunderstood, Brueggemann says. Misunderstandings of substance likely occur because the style and character of the literature is misunderstood. A faithful understanding of these materials requires that the interpreters be clear about the nature of the material presented and the relationship it has to the remainder of Scripture. Now, what's in Genesis 1 to 11, and why is it so important? Well, you have all these ancient etiologies, and it turns out, if you study this stuff in seminary or maybe in college, you learn that some of the stories existed, like the flood and two brothers and stuff existed beforehand, but they're recrafted by the people who pulled together the Bible to achieve a particular effect. So these etiologies, stories about how things came to be, provide in the hands of the last people who got their hands on the Bible. And bear in mind, these things were in scrolls, were in fragments. Different people pulled them together. Sometime around the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, or shortly thereafter, they're getting the stuff lined up in what we think of as a canonical order. And some of the material, say the first story of creation in Genesis, where we show up on day 6, we're really late to the party, and God's been calling it good and all. That's very, very late. Why all of these beginnings stories? Why not just start with Abraham? The purpose of this 1 through 11 and these ancient stories is both to provide a history, but also to provide a universal history in which God is the ruler of all humanity. Humanity makes problems, and God keeps coming back. That's what the whole story of the Hebrew Bible is going to be. The law, the prophets, the wisdom writings, is all about that. Okay, so God's goodness, humanity's repeated rebellion, we learn where violence comes from and disorder, and the founding of Babel, not Babylon, and we see these particular stories: creation, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, generations and early heroes, Noah and the flood, and God establishes again and again versions of covenants with people. God does not walk away even though people are lousy. That's one of the big stories of the whole Bible, Old Testament and New. God says to Noah after the destruction, "Whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human shall that person's blood be shed." What's he saying? What's God saying? Not me. I'm not going to do this. You might. Very interesting. For in his own image, God made humankind. This is kind of royal speech. Why is it here? Was it really what God said to Noah, or is it what we need to hear about what happens after the flood? I would conjecture on the basis of biblical studies, it's the latter. The editors wrote for people as late as the 4th century BCE to understand what the whole project had been about. Creation, calling of Abraham, exile into Egypt, coming into Canaan, going into exile in Babylon, coming back, no kings, but we have a temple. What's the whole project about? It's about what God is doing with humanity. Now, Christians typically aren't as tuned into this as Jews are, right? Some Christians don't even read the Old Testament very much at all, let alone some of the hardcore stuff like Leviticus and Deuteronomy, where they try to establish a society based upon laws that will reinforce the 10 Commandments and what have you. But another great book in this series by, just coincidentally, Patrick Miller, who was who's now deceased, but was Walter Brueggemann's brother-in-law and taught at Union Seminary and Princeton Seminary. He has a great book on the Ten Commandments, and his argument there is Genesis is all prequel, if we will, to Ten Commandments. The people who are doing the editing have in mind the responsive activity of loving God and loving neighbor that are on the two tables of the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments being a summary of the law. The later laws being sort of like, so what do we do if my neighbor's cow knocks over a fence? Well, the neighbor pays for the fence. Look at Leviticus. There's really interesting stuff in there. It's mostly not what we think of as brutal eye for eye justice, but a working out of things that you could have worked out for yourself in the Ten Commandments. The first table of the law is about obligations back towards God. The second table of the law is obligations toward neighbor. So let's go to Cain and Abel for a moment. I like this. This is a relief where we see on the one side Cain and Abel each trying to present to God, and you see the God hand coming down. Their cereal offerings or a animal sacrifice. That lamb doesn't look dead to me, but and then the next scene on the other side of the pillar is Cain killing Abel out in the field, and then if you split it diagonally, you see God represented talking to Cain and asking, "Where's your brother?" I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? And trying to get away from it. And here's the story, right? Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let us go out to the field." And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. So he's lured him out. This is pretty rough stuff. Then the Lord says to Cain, "Where's your brother, Abel?" He said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And the Lord said, What have you done?" God knows what he's done. "Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the side of the earth." Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Today you have driven me away from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and anyone who meets me may kill me." Then the Lord said to him, "Not so. Whoever kills Cain will suffer a sevenfold vengeance." And the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who came upon him would kill him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Now, what's interesting about that, of course, is how many people are there supposed to be? These stories don't line up. They're not supposed to line up. It's not a population census of all the people who might kill Cain, because after all, There were just four, according to our simple thinking. But the story is told here to tell us about who God is and about how life goes on even after terrible, horrible things happen. There are consequences for Cain, but it's not the end. And God puts a mark on it to protect him. So takeaways, and we could do this with a lot of texts in the Old Testament, Ten Commandments itself. We're responsible for our actions before God. We are our brother's keepers. When bad things happen, there will be consequences. The 10 Commandments, the 613 laws are all about restoring relationship. There's a day after the bad things happen. Now, I want to come back to the contemporary and note how many Christians around us or on the radio or in front of a state capitol act as though bad things by their own lights are the end of the world, right? There's no comeback for some of these folks. It's all kind of like a Book of Revelation end. It's not a steady state kind of life of Christian faith. So how do we get there? Well, and here I want to go back to Rex Baker. There are three kinds of responsibility that get used in the Christian community. We could proliferate these further, but first kind is personal responsibility, being responsible as a person for your own actions. There's also social responsibility, being responsible to and for others. And then there's a sense of collective responsibility where we realize we're all in this together, and some of the things we face are bigger than personal responsibility or maybe even social responsibility can fix. Great example of collective responsibility would be climate change. Clearly, if we could get all the Christians in the room and to agree, that wouldn't be enough. We have to talk to Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists and people of no faith to work things out. So the question here is, how big is your circle and conception of responsibility as a Christian? And let's go to Rex Baker and see how he explains it. He writes in an essay, we believe in proper charity. We strive to work with two groups of people, those who are willing to help themselves and those who are unable to help themselves. Some people need temporary assistance and a gentle push to get back on their feet. Some need long-term help breaking an addiction. If they're willing to help themselves, we are here to help them. He went on. Others simply are not able to help themselves due to physical or mental limitations or both. Our work with them is a ministry of mercy. We see people every day who depend on a meal from our kitchen for proper nutrition, and we're here to help them also. But we try to draw the line with those who are able but unwilling to help themselves. And so his shelter has a rule: 3 nights per month max. If you're willing to get sober in 3 days, we'll help you. If you're still the same way you are on the 4th day, not so much. It's really interesting to see people driven by Matthew 25 kind of spirituality. I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was homeless and you gave me somewhere, you gave me a home. On and on. It's also awesome in a bad way to see that this region that we live in is the region where more Christians proportionally have probably been to a prison as part of a prison ministry, but it's also the region with the highest incarceration rate. And in the case of Louisiana, the highest incarceration rate in the world. How do we get to that kind of place where we love our neighbors, we'll visit them in jail, and we limit them to 3 nights in our shelter? So if that's personal responsibility and a kind of tough love personal responsibility, and we all probably grew up with a certain amount of personal responsibility laid upon us. These things actually layer, right? That our parents probably told us, you know, if you went with fast boys, if you drank, if you smoked, if you did drugs, terrible things were going to happen. And you had to take personal responsibility for those things not happening. We all raise our children to some degree with this personal responsibility, but is that the end? No, I'd argue that social responsibility is a moral worldview that holds we are responsible to and for our neighbors. In its modern conception, the conditions under which our neighbors suffer and chafe are fair game for intervention. So, of the groups that we have in the United States, most evangelicals are on board with the rest of us with personal responsibility. Social responsibility is where it begins to break down. Social responsibility was characteristic of American Christians at the turn of the last century during the time of the social gospel. So we went from being quietistic about things as awful as slavery to 45 years later getting rid of working on the Sabbath and half of Saturday for adults, to the 40-hour work week, to no child labor for anybody under 16, so they could, and universal schooling. All of this was the result of Protestants who we now think of as mainline or evangelical, mainline or ecumenical, who back then thought of themselves as evangelical, who asked themselves, what would Jesus do about every problem they encountered? And all of these reforms, you know, even food safety reforms, were led by religious people who were concerned that mothers would buy cheap fake milk that was actually had lead in it to make it look whiter, you know, in New York and places like that. These became Christian issues. Fascinating kind of time. So the ecumenical Protestants still carried this through for a fairly long time until they began experiencing declines in the middle of the 1960s. And all the time that they were sort of large and in charge, they also tended to bring their social responsibility into the public sphere in a much, along with personal responsibility, in a much larger way in terms of the laws that were enacted. They were not so much prohibitions on things, but opportunities to do other things. So the mainline Protestants then went from 1965 until now from well over 50% of all Americans, well over 50% in 1958. It was 52%, down to about 12% of the population today. So we're no longer the ideological center of American Christianity. We share that. Now, this social responsibility ideal is certainly something that most ministers in our traditions, in the ecumenical traditions, would still teach from the pulpit or a place like this. Even if some of their members were a little less willing to go along with the consequences of a particular action, of a particular preaching. But there's the belief that sin is sometimes bigger than what individual people do. It's structural or systemic. We're caught in webs not purely of our personal making. Now, in the relationship between ecumenical or mainline folks and evangelicals, we see then a divide. The evangelicals largely embrace personal responsibility and think that, oh gosh, something like racism is an affair of the heart. It's not structural. There are no things that you should do as a society. You don't see race and you treat everybody nice. Picture Billy Graham if you want a stand-in for this kind of thing. The ecumenicals, meanwhile, tend to think that the evangelicals are parochial and a little bit, their Christianity isn't up to the size of challenges that are before us. What about the Catholics and the Black Church? If you go back to the civil rights movement, it was a remarkable era of people coming together at Selma and other such places across the evangelical, Black Church, ecumenical, and Catholic sort of standpoint, and agreeing that something needed to be done about voting rights and about the civil rights of Black Americans, especially here in the South. Where are they today? Is that old coalition still together? Not so much. So the Catholic Church is riven by people who think that John Paul II was the best pope, and people who think that Francis is the best pope, right? There is this, we should still be speaking Latin. It's all been bad since Vatican II. We should all be speaking Latin in the Mass. Or Francis's care for the poor is right where the heart of the church is. Catholicism inherits a sense of being responsible for all of society from the Middle Ages, right? In what happens after 400 AD, there emerges one prince in a place, and the Catholic Church as the soul of that prince or king's or emperor's domain. Now that's broken down. And I want to talk a little bit about how that all breaks down. And I've already talked a little bit about how collectivity and doing things on a large scale is also a vision. What happens over the history of Christianity is that different kinds of churches emerge. Oh, let me say just a side thing about the Black church. The Black church that was probably the poster child for doing church that best combines personal responsibility, they would call it holiness, and social responsibility and collective responsibility was the old civil rights Black church. I don't know if you've kept up on what's going on inside Black Christianity today, but it's riven between people who kind of see things in the old Martin Luther King Jr. trajectory and people who are all about the prosperity gospel. There's more than enough, I'm coming to get my stuff, as one popular prosperity praise chorus goes. You know, it's all about getting our stuff. And so it's become less about social responsibility and more about God wants you to be rich inside the Black church. So each of our churches has a problem relating to the others. The moral crisis is in part that churches aren't working together. But it happened for a reason. And I want to kind of conclude with some concentration on this and then take any questions about this. We talked about how the Old Testament, the law, created a society and set of relationships from Genesis onwards that was meant to hold a society together, a godly society, the people Israel. And even if they failed, and often did, they had the rabbis had recourse to what we should do next. Early Christianity, even though it descends out of Judaism, is not a religion with a theory of the state. Read the writings of Paul, and he's talking to other Christians, and his social horizon is other Christians. How do beleaguered Christians get along in a Roman society and in some places in a Jewish dominated city like Jerusalem? Paul's concern are what other Christians do for each other. Now, one of the things that Protestantism comes around to in America in a big way is deciding we need to be like the New Testament church. Here's the problem with that. You're not beleaguered Christians in a hostile society. You actually can vote, you can petition your government, you're in charge of your own affairs. You're actually more like you're more like the Romans than you are like the early Christians when it comes to political and moral activity. But people keep going back to Paul. Medieval Catholicism, I've said a little bit about. There's one church. There's one government. We whisper in the prince's ear to keep his soul straight, and we manage heaven while the prince manages earth. The Reformation breaks this down 500 years ago. Even the magisterial Reformation, so-called because they decide we need a Reformed church, could be Lutheran, could be Reformed, could be Presbyterian, could be Congregational, but we still are going to have one church and one prince or king or what have you. At the same time, however, some people take that even farther and say we shouldn't have anything to do with the government. This world is fallen. Think Anabaptists, Mennonites, Amish, and their Quakers. Their challenge is we're going to be peaceful Christians with nothing to do with armies and kings and princes and knights and all that stuff because they're not of God. Okay, so now the Catholic Church in the West and to some degree in the East, places like Hungary, is facing dissent. And to the Catholics, we look like heretics. To what becomes the mainline, the Reformation traditions like Presbyterians, the Anabaptists look like heretics. Now Christianity is torn asunder, and we have differing views of what we owe one another. Let's call this the moment of sectarian imagination. And for the last 500 years, to various degrees, there has been an ongoing war of opinion about who counts in the kingdom of God. Is it just other Christians? Is it something that's as big as a society? Is it something as big as a globe? So I've said this has been going on for 500 years, but if you have a sense that it's gotten worse, that it hasn't always been this bad, has it? I would agree with you, and I'd say the shift towards more churches and Christians thinking that their obligations are principally to other Christians, people you can find in the Christian yellow pages, right? Those are the businesses you should go to. And defining your Christian concern narrowly by adherence to spiritual laws or fundamentals or conservative behaviors in politics. And here I'm not talking about garden variety republicanism. I'm talking like, some of us would engage in. I'm talking about really conservative QAnon kind of stuff. That has snowballed. That has snowballed since 1970, with the effect that a new conception of the unitary state has taken over. There's one right way of being, and it's oddly combined with a Pauline view that it's just us Christians in a beleaguered world, and we need to elect all of our own kind and take over all the machinery of state. It's a very odd sort of moment that we've reached where people have both a sectarian imagination and a will to the levers of power. And I'll take some questions, but next time I'll offer some ideas about how we reknit our society and our churches by returning to the question, who is my neighbor? So with that, we got about a minute or two for questions. Yeah. Okay. So there's a bad form of collective responsibility, right? That is like making all the Ukrainians, little 3-month-old Ukrainians responsible for resisting Russian troops, because obviously there is no Ukraine. Collective responsibility got a really bad name in the Holocaust. There's another side of collective responsibility, which is we're all in this together. All of humanity is under one God, that being your viewpoint. So even folks who aren't Christian, who don't belong to your kind of church, you make common cause with to solve problems like, and the classic example right now is climate change. What would be some others? Human trafficking, things that take you beyond just Americans and Christians per se. Okay, so it's we can be socially responsible and still not as big in our moral outlook as the problems we face. What? So I'll give you the answer here, which is actually we have to combine all three. If the ecumenical folks the mainline folks have a fault where they've strayed from the Eisenhower, Kennedy years, if you will, Truman years, is a sense as they've lost power that, oh, it's all those evangelicals' fault. You know, personal responsibility is a bunch of hooey. You know, nobody raises their kids without a sense of personal responsibility. So a sense of acknowledgement about, yeah, we personally are responsible for our interactions. We're together responsible for the frame, our laws and our customs socially, and we even have a piece of big problems because we live in God's world, not the other way around. You know, if God lives in our world, then we have too small a God. Yeah.
This change in reference is 1970. Any sense of backlash against civil rights?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. You know, not everybody was, as you'll remember, not everybody was aboard with civil rights. And even the 1968 election with Nixon talking about law and order all the time. You know, just incidentally, Richard Nixon, the most un-Quaker Quaker. You know, if he'd been a better Quaker, would we have come through it a little better? But he also did some, you know, good things with Pat Moynihan that didn't come to. But to answer your question, yes, I think there's it's not just having the right outlook on things, it's actually continuing to execute and reknit. And like we learned with a Genesis, it's picking up the pieces when things go bad. It's making peace rather than trying to get back at, you know, we've been engaged for 50 years now in a kind of politics of revenge. And that's liberals and conservatives. Donovan preaches about this a fair amount. You know, it's nobody is blameless in this whole game. But 1970 represents a turn that the so-called excesses of the hippies and the civil rights era kind of brought on a strong reaction. Yeah, Donald.
I was thinking about Lincoln's second inaugural, that each reads the scriptures, each side reads the scriptures. You know, you can read abortion, you know, on the conservative side, or you can read climate change on the liberal side. And both have a point, right?
Right, but both have a point, and they're not talking together about the center. They're just, in some sense, using those. You know, how many laws this year in all of our states are being enacted to position parties to win, rather than because it's the right thing to do. I grew up in Michigan with George Romney as a governor, and I remember laws being enacted because they were like the right thing to do, even against Romney's own interests. You know, aid to Detroit schools, aid to Catholic parochial schools in the form of textbooks and free busing, because the Catholics had paid the same taxes as the people who went to public schools. you know, what is it that winds us up towards God versus apart from our brothers?
The cause becomes God. Right? Whatever it is, becomes the God by which we live.
Oh, yeah, it's a certain, I am not saying that abortion is good or bad. I'm saying it can become an idol in the fight. It's actually a lot more complicated than either side wants to make it. And the avoidance of complications is a form of evil.
And is that because now we have a multitude of communications that we can listen to as opposed
Yeah, my class on global Christianities, the contemporary era, the students were talking about how different things were. We were looking at Billy Graham and Fulton Sheen and even John F. Kennedy and Malcolm X, and they're talking to 3 networks. And, you know, I came home from school and, you know, there were Channel 2, Channel 4, and Channel 7, period. You all remember that. But part of that, what?
you're too late to turn the channel.
Yeah, sometimes, exactly. Yeah, no remotes in my household. Where was going? Oh, so students today are very much aware when they look at something like that we had at least a common conversation. And I'll point to Birmingham. You know, when they used fire hoses and dogs against children in 1963 in Birmingham, the nation finally took notice. Every nightly news and said something's wrong with this. Now, something that had been wrong for a long time, but this seemed particularly wrong. And if you haven't been to the Birmingham Civil Rights Museum, it's worth going. There is a room in which they have the national media's coverage and the local media's coverage. Oh, you just don't understand. Coverage. This is a wonderful city, et cetera, et cetera. It's, you know, it's Christians all around, right? So, all right. Well, thank you. And we'll see you next 2 weeks from now.